Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the workshop entitled Transnational Corruption, Shedding Light on the Networks that Enable Environmental Crimes, organized by the Wildlife Justice Commission. My name is Lynn Schlingemann. I am Senior Associate on Financial Crimes and Corruption at the Nature Crime Alliance, and I'm honored to be here today and joined by an expert panel to discuss the nexus between transnational corruption, environmental crimes, and other forms of serious transnational organized crime. I would start to introduce each one of our panelists. With me here today is Lisa Hartfeld, Director of External Relations and Communications at the Wildlife Justice Commission. In this role, she leverages the Wildlife Justice Commission's expertise in wildlife crime and insights from their on-the-ground operations to raise awareness and build political will at a global and multilateral level. Lisa also chairs the UNCAC Coalition's Working Group on Environmental Crime and Corruption, which consists of over 200 members of civil society from across the globe working on the intersection of environmental crime and corruption. And prior to WJC, the Wildlife Justice Commission, Lisa worked at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Lisa, I'm very happy to have you join us here today.
Thank you.
I would also like to introduce now Ian Gary. Ian Gary is Executive Director of the US-based Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition. The FACT Coalition is the largest US anti-corruption coalition and campaigns to end the status of the US as a top financial secrecy jurisdiction. The coalition has achieved notable successes, including the 2021 enactment of the Corporate Transparency Act, establishing a registry of the true owners of anonymous shell companies. Prior to FACT, Ian worked with Foxfam, the Ford Foundation, and other NGOs in the US and across Africa. Welcome, Ian. Christina Ammerhauser is a senior analyst working on the Global Initiatives Against Transnational Organized Crime's flagship environmental crime project called EcoSolve, where she leads the work stream on corruption. She also co-leads the organization's work on illicit financial flows. She's worked with GI Talks Observatory of Illicit Economies in the Asia Pacific and was responsible for overseeing the program in Southeast Asia, as well as civil society, government, and multilateral engagement in the region. Prior to this, she worked on the Southeastern Europe, conducting analysis on issues such as illicit financial flows, migrant smuggling, and how to strengthen civil society resilience to organized crime and corruption in the region. I would like to finally introduce Tim Steele. Welcome, Tim. Tim Steele is the chief of the field support section of UNODC's Corruption and Economic Crime branch and a forensic accountant by training. Tim has been involved in anti-corruption and asset recovery work for over 20 years. This included policy making, specifically as an embedded advisor to the Zambian and Kenyan anti-corruption commissions, and headed the anti-corruption team for the UK Department for International Development. I think this proves that we have an expert panel with us today to discuss this very important topic of environmental crime, which is often overseen in these types of forums. So I'm really happy that it's featured so prominently here at the IACC. Environmental crime has become the third most lucrative crime industry for transnational organized criminal groups, generating up to $280 billion a year. It destabilizes communities, economies, and the environment. Despite increasingly being recognized as a serious financial crime, nature crime remains a high-profit, low-risk crime. Financial crimes, including money laundering, tax evasion, corruption, are embedded in these crimes, and I think it's no secret that perpetrators rely on the legitimate financial sector to launder their proceeds. Interpol estimates that 38% of the incomes to non-state armed groups and terrorist organizations comes from environmental crimes, which is more than drug trafficking. We have outlined four main objectives for today's workshop. First of all, we'd like to raise awareness on the convergence between environmental crime, corruption, and other forms of serious organized crimes. We would like to highlight the opportunities that crime convergence can also present for policymakers and law enforcement. We'd also like to discuss the different roles that civil society, public institutions, and the private sector can play in tackling environmental crime. And we'd like to advance priority policy recommendations to address the corruption that facilitates these crimes. I work for the Nature Crime Alliance. which recognizes the crime of convergence between environmental crimes and other forms of serious transnational organized crime. And the Nature Crime Alliance aims to develop a more comprehensive approach to tackling these crimes. We were launched in August 2023 as a global multi-sector network that aims to raise its political will, mobilize financial commitment, and bolster operational capacity to fight nature crimes. Working in different working groups, financial crimes is a priority area for the Nature Crime Alliance, and we recognize the need to link up financial intelligence units, FIUs, and financial institutions to tackle environmental crime, which I'll also discuss a little bit further today. But I don't want to be too long, and I want to hand over to our panelists to discuss this important topic and starting with setting the scene, to highlight a little bit about how environmental crimes how they are linked to transnational corruption and what facilitates crimes across the supply chain. And I would like to start with you, Lisa, from the Wildlife Justice Commission. What are your perspectives, and can you elaborate on some of the key ways through which transnational corruption facilitates environmental crimes across the supply chain, and maybe highlight through a case study?
Thank you so much, Lynn, and really great to be here today. So first of all, maybe just to say that environmental crimes really include a broad range of crimes, including trafficking in wildlife, which is an area that we work on, waste, illegal mining, illegal logging, and pollution. Since 2015, the Wildlife Justice Commission's investigations have found extensive evidence of the key role that corruption plays in enabling wildlife crime and its occurrence across the global supply chain. So really from source, transit, to destination countries. Without corruption, there would be no environmental crime at this level. We really see in our findings a symbiotic relationship between environmental crime and corruption, meaning that corruption really allows organized environmental crime to flourish, while the crime provides the financial and social incentives that can entice individuals to become engaged in corrupt activity. Last year, we published a comprehensive report on the role of corruption as one of the most important enabling factors behind wildlife crime. So I'm going to outline just a few examples from that report on how transnational corruption facilitates such crimes. So firstly, when looking at the source country, so from poaching to supply, some of the examples that we've seen include corrupt officials. They can be the very staff employed to protect wildlife at parks, such as game scouts and rangers providing tip-offs to poachers. Corruption also occurs in the permit process, which is one of the highest corruption risks where it comes to wildlife crime, in particular in relation to illegal timber. And we've also documented leakage or theft from government stockpiles of, for example, rhino horn, ivory, and pangolin scales. When a wildlife product is smuggled from source to destination countries, we see corruption included in bribery of customs officers, shipping companies, freight forwarders, security agencies at air cargo and seaports. And to give you an example here of one of our investigations, which spanned over a two-year period into turtle and tortoise trafficking in South and Southeast Asia, we found that the chosen smuggling route from seller to buyer depended on several factors, all of which involved corruption. This included the ability to bribe officials at border checkpoints or at airports, price differences for corrupt payments, the work schedule of corrupt officials to be on call to actually facilitate the illicit shipment, and whether corrupt officials were seizing stock and they were actually forcing groups to pay a tax for their release. And then for distribution and trade, we often see bribery of law enforcement protection and warnings of law enforcement activity, and government officials often themselves act as buyers and facilitators as well. And lastly, also fraudulent import documents. And a quick example here as well, dating back to 2015, where one of our investigators was told by a trader that Nikkei village in Vietnam was a so-called special place. That traders there paid a monthly fee to local law enforcement officers in exchange for protection, allowing them to openly display the sale of rhino horn and of elephant ivory products, while advance warning would be provided for any law enforcement inspections. And then lastly, to mention corruption in the criminal justice chain, which includes bribery to obstruct investigations and trials, to secure bail, or even release from custody. So in a nutshell, we really see corruption providing a feeling of impunity to criminal networks. And again, it's one of the biggest obstacles we see to effective law enforcement.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. It's really interesting, and really looking from, from the source country to the final destination country, how, corruption is an obstacle embedded in the entire supply chain, which requires a comprehensive approach. And I would like to hand over now to Tim. Tim, I would like to ask you, environmental crime converges with other forms of serious organized crimes, and maybe you could use some examples from your work at UNODC where you've seen this crime convergence happening and taking place.
Yeah, I might even go before UNODC. The first time I saw it was back in 2002, 2003. By chance, personal friends owned 3 prime game lodges in Lower Zambezi. These lodges were full in the season, and they were charging a lot of money for those days, sort of $800 or $1,000 a night, 100% occupancy. Those people, they were comfortable, but they weren't rich. There were other game lodges in Lower Zambezi where they charged about $250 a night, and they maybe had 20, 30% occupancy because they didn't do any marketing. Those people were wealthy. Go to do the math. Obvious money laundering operation. And not, at that time, not just wildlife crime, but broader money laundering, actually through protected areas. First example I saw, I'll not go naming lots of countries, unless it's a good case example, but 2 East African countries, one which had a fine for export at the time, for exporting wildlife product, one where you could get up to 20 years in prison. The criminals used the port where you get 20 years in prison. The reason for it? Well, the brother of the governor of that particular region, of that country, was a facilitator of import-export. And he didn't really just specialize in wildlife product, pretty much anything. This leads on to business models. I mean, with organized crime groups, you see a wide range of different sort of business models they do everything from the sourcing of the product, whatever it is, whether it be a tree, whether it be an animal part, right through to the sort of retail. There's others who specialize in one part of the trail. Now, particularly the ones that specialize in transporting, or the ones that specialize in moving money, you will see do not really care what the product is. So if we think a little bit about this, again, not going into huge detail because I don't want to talk forever. If you look into some of the South American, some of the Amazon countries where there's an awful lot of really quite horrible environmental crime, there's also quite a lot of drug smuggling. Now, you see some clearance of forest for growing of cocoa, but it's not the big issue. The big issue is who's actually moving the product. And if you've got a network to move one product, it's like any transport company. If you've got a transport company, you move things. And if you've got a illegal transport company, you move illegal transport. You transport illegal goods. It doesn't matter what the good is, particularly. The example I think I thought I would speak about is I'll name it as northern Mozambique, which is basically plagued, sadly, by sort of radicalized terrorists. So not too now, but it also has a very lively sort of drug trade and a very lively wildlife trade. In Niassa province, a lot of forestry as well. Basically, the insurgency, the drug trade, the environmental crime, they all play off each other. Same people sometimes, but taking opportunities for each other. Finally, I'll give a good case example. You mentioned the idea of disrupting the sort of criminal justice network. It's very interesting. In Malawi, the Longway Wildlife Trust, an NGO in Malawi, a few years back, started monitoring court processes, providing some support to investigators, prosecutors, but they monitored them to make sure there was no corruption. Two things happened. The conviction rate went up from low 20% to somewhere in the 90%, and also the average sentence went up from a fine of a sort of desultory amount of, say, a few dollars to imprisonment for poaching. So you saw, just by monitoring and watching, you could push up, and it also sadly proved that previously there'd been something badly wrong, probably bribery, but who knows. Back to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Tim. That's really interesting, especially looking also a bit towards, the networks that are already in place and talking more about also looking at the destination countries and some of the other jurisdictions and their role, which might not traditionally be seen as, source countries from environmental crimes. But I'm turning over now to you, Ian, because I know that Fact Coalition recently published a very interesting report looking more at the role of the US also as a jurisdiction in terms of hiding the proceeds from environmental crimes in your report, Dirty Money and Destruction of the Amazon, uncovering the role of the US in financial flows from environmental crimes. Perhaps you can highlight a little bit more about the findings of that report and also the role of the US as a jurisdiction and some of your findings in terms of banking secrecy and hiding the proceeds of environmental crime.
Sure, I'd love to do that, Lynn, and thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I apologize to people who have to...
Mike.
Can you hear me now? All right. I was just apologizing for people who have to look at the back of my head. No, it's great to be part of this conversation. I really hope that we get to hear a lot from experts in the room, because I know there are a lot of rich experiences that we hope to hear from during the question and answer session. But Lynn, as you said, there's only recently been, I think in the United States, at the highest levels of policy making, a recognition that the US is the easiest place to hide dirty money. And that was something that was recognized by our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, at the Summit for Democracy a couple of years ago. You ask the average American whether they think the US is the easiest place to hide dirty money, they might say Switzerland. We ranked #1 recently above Switzerland. I got a lot of media inquiries from Switzerland, so they were very eager to talk about how they have gone down the list a little bit. So trying to tie together the issue of dirty money, US as a secrecy jurisdiction, and the fact that a lot of the illicit finance from these environmental crimes are coming into the US is something that we've started to do recently as the FACT Coalition. And I think there have been less attention on, as you suggest, destination countries, both for the products or, in the case of wildlife, the animals, but also for the money that's generated from these crimes. A recent survey by the Financial Action Task Force of 44 countries found that jurisdictions that are identified as source countries for these products are, in some cases, making concrete steps to address money laundering from environmental crimes, But it also noted, quote, that fewer countries in Europe and North America seem to have considered the money laundering risks from environmental crimes. As a result, this affects the allocation of resources and interagency collaboration to tackle these crimes. So I think that is the responsibility of global North countries to address this side of the equation. As you mentioned, we published last October a report called Dirty Money and the Destruction of the Amazon. And that report, a few copies are in the back, identified a number of cases where the proceeds of nature crimes like illegal mining, illegal logging, entered the US financial system. And it's easy to do that because there are weak rules related to anonymous shell companies, to money laundering through real estate, which I'll talk about. Many of the cases that we've mentioned will involve third countries, so we'll go from a source country to a second country, and then finally end up in the United States. One of those examples is a case from 2014, a Chilean national, a 23-year-old student who was ambitious probably in all of the wrong ways, was able to smuggle gold likely from the Madre de Dios region of Peru via Chile and into the United States. He used a number of anonymous shell companies, many of those registered in the United States, and ended up exporting around $80 million into the US. Unlike the declarations that you have to make if you're carrying physical cash above $10,000, you can just move gold easily into the United States. He created shell companies that allowed him to purchase real estate in Miami. So those are some of the channels that have been used to move proceeds from environmental crimes. And so this kind of case exemplifies the use of anonymous shell companies and the US financial system.
Thanks, Ian. That's very interesting, and also, from my own experience with the Alliance, we work with a lot of banks in working groups, and we've seen that a lot of the financial investigators, also from the FIUs, often have difficulty in terms of detecting environmental crimes. It's in the mixing of legal with illegal within the supply chain is also a huge issue, and I think that would lead nicely over to you, Christina, because I know that EcoSolve is one of the tools that could help financial investigators, because it's obvious that there's a need for more data-driven tools to inform law enforcement and policymakers about corrupt actors as well, and the facilitators of environmental crimes. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the work of GI Talk in this space, and specifically EcoSolve as a tool to support these efforts.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here today. I'm honored to represent the Global Initiative here, and colleagues have already spoken quite a lot about the growing awareness around organized environmental crimes and the harms and the impact it has on communities and societies. And while there is increasing awareness on the issue, including where it converges with other types of crime and the role that corruption plays, looking at the current responses, it really becomes quite clear that we're still falling short of addressing the vulnerabilities on the ground. And from our work on environmental crime across the world, we see that combating it requires sound data and up-to-date technological approaches across a large number of commodity flows. And yet many of the data resources that we have available and that would help us undermine illicit environmental flows are patchy, fragmented, or don't exist at all. And so, in addition to that, actually, many of the data collection methods are not aligned across the organizations that are trying to respond to environmental crimes, and existing data sources are either not accessible or are not interoperable. And the lack of data was actually also highlighted in a review that we did on current responses to environmental crime at the Global Initiative, which found that one of the key reasons why law enforcement and policymakers struggle with the response to environmental crime was insufficient data, lack of cooperation, and/or innovation to get ahead of criminal market adaptation. And so we've, in order to respond to some of these concerns and to address some of these limitations, we've designed EcoSolve, as you've mentioned. It's a 3-year-long program, part of the EU's Global Illicit Flows program, and it really has data for disruption at the core of the project. So EcoSolve has a number of different components. It includes a global monitoring system of the global illegal wildlife trade. It includes gathering information to expose elite protection and corruption, specifically driving the timber trade. It includes increasing community engagement on environmental crime strategies, and it tries to build a platform that can provide constructive analysis and guidance, as well as generate conversations to promote better data cooperation. But given the focus on corruption here, I really wanted to focus on our work on corruption and why we've also chosen that approach. And I think it was mentioned multiple times by all panelists that there's more and more attention being put on corruption and environmental crime and the different entry points of corruption along the supply chain. And what we see in these analyses is that corruption really ranges from low-level bribery to high-level elite protection. And we're focusing specifically on elite protection because what really stands out to us in our work is that how elites often see environmental resources as an easy entry point for personal enrichment. We're also observing that the lines between business, politics, and crimes are becoming increasingly blurred, and that there's more and more evidence that it's often corruption and elite protections why laws are not enforced or cases don't progress through the judicial system. And while there's definitely no one-size-fits-all solution to addressing all of this, the aim of our work is to increase the risks and the costs for elites who engage in corruption by exposing their facilitation of environmental crime, placing the names of businesses and companies linked to their activities on the record. And the exposés aim to trigger law enforcement actions and investigations that could flag high-risk transactions and individual account holders. We've identified a number of priority regions around the world, including the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia, and we'll seek to publish the investigations through local and international media outlets. And so, to come back to your question, I think there's 3 main ways, really, in which the data that we're gathering on elite corruption can inform policymakers and law enforcement in their response. So first, I think the investigations may trigger more scrutiny, as well as sanctions or travel restrictions as information that exposes the wrongdoing of elites in connection to environmental crime is made publicly available. Second, by working closely with investigative journalists, researchers, and anti-corruption experts on the ground, the investigations also help to build their skills to analyze, identify, and publish data on elite protection, which in turn will hopefully create more data and awareness on the issue and also help policymakers and law enforcement to prioritize the issue. And then thirdly, we're also looking to publish typology reports that draw together some of the findings across different exposés that will discuss and analyze the structural enablers and drivers of environmental crime, and by providing direct insights into key areas where corruption drives and facilitates environmental crimes, we think that improved law enforcement responses can be developed.
Thank you, Christina. It was a very comprehensive answer, and I think you also provide a very good segue into the part 2 of this discussion, where we will look a bit more into best practices and law enforcement opportunities, and you highlighting the making available of this information is a very important aspect of this. And I would like to turn back to you, Lisa, to maybe highlight some of the how the responses to transnational corruption risks could be strengthened in your view, and in particularly the opportunities that also the crime convergence that's highlighted here today linked to environmental crimes could provide for law enforcement and policymakers looking perhaps at a bit more unconventional tools as well.
Thank you. So in terms of crime convergence, through our own investigations, we collected evidence of the increased involvement of organized crime groups and cases where wildlife crime is committed in conjunction with other forms of serious crime, which could include corruption, money laundering, but also drug trafficking, for instance, as also evidenced by Tim's example of the Amazon basin just now. What we've seen is that in terms of, I guess, when the second part of your question, to start off with that, law enforcement can leverage opportunities also caused by this concept of crime convergence. For example, in investigations, unfortunately, it's still the case that wildlife crime is often perceived to be lower risk by criminal networks in comparison to other forms of serious crime. And as a result, they often operate a bit more at a lower guard. And this can sometimes present a good entry point for law enforcement to infiltrate these criminal networks that might actually be engaging not only in wildlife trafficking, but also in other forms of transnational organized crime. There are also advantages of environmental and wildlife crime laws. In some countries, these laws provide enforcement powers that might not exist for other forms of crime. For example, the power to act without a warrant or inspect premises at any time, which is obviously an advantage. This can also work the other way around, where legislation relating to convergent or ancillary offenses such as money laundering may allow for alternate law enforcement powers or the application of higher penalties. In terms of strengthening response to transnational corruption, I'd like to outline 4 main recommendations based on our operational findings. Firstly, and I think this has been addressed before, but really to successfully address environmental crime and corruption, as well as the other crimes with which these crimes converge, these crimes should not be treated as separate issues under law enforcement responses. So the transnational corruption risks must really be identified and addressed in parallel with efforts to investigate and prosecute the criminal offense. There are a number of law enforcement methodologies, such as special investigative techniques, financial investigations, and intelligence analysis, which are really key, I guess, more standard law enforcement methodologies that are also really successful in tackling these types of crimes. And what is great about these methodologies is that they really help target high-level offenders, so really those that are responsible for orchestrating the crime rather than, for example, in the case of wildlife crime, the poaching level. And this is important because this really causes the highest level of disruption in these criminal supply chains. Another recommendation includes the establishment of vetted units within law enforcement agencies, which could help make these agencies more corrupt resistant, conducting follow-up investigations, but above all, collaboration is key. This includes multi-agency cooperation, so joint investigations and task forces to bring necessary law enforcement expertise together to target all converging crimes, including the corruption aspects, and explore all angles of criminal scenarios. International cooperation, considering the cross-border nature of these crimes, is crucial. It's crucial to address the full trafficking route, so the source, transit, and destination countries, as well as corrupt facilitators along this global supply chain. And this includes sharing information on seizures and arrests to support any linkages and identifying members of a criminal network, and as I mentioned before, the corrupt facilitators. And in this regard, publicly reporting seizures is also a good practice to ensure transparency and accountability. And then also in relation to collaboration, and this has been mentioned, I notice in various other events today and in plenary in relation to environmental crime and corruption, is the cross-sectoral form of collaboration, which also includes NGOs. And so I'd like to just end with an example of such a form of collaboration where we were involved as Wildlife Justice Commission. Last year, we worked very closely together with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we supported the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. And they arrested 11 suspects, which included 2 customs officers and other members of an international wildlife trafficking network. And this syndicate was believed to have bribed law enforcement officers and allowed them to take wildlife contraband meant for disposal from a customs department warehouse and sell them after faking its destruction. In addition, the syndicate was believed to be involved in money laundering as well. Authorities seized just under 2 tons of pangolin scales, as well as several luxury vehicles with an estimated value of $5 million US. And then 2 weeks ago, actually, on the 31st of May, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission made an additional significant arrest in this case, apprehending a senior customs officer and formally charging the officer with misappropriation of property in relation to the seized pangolin scales. So this really underscored the commitment of this law enforcement authority to identifying and arresting high-level criminal orchestrators and not just the operatives. And other important law enforcement methodologies, which I previously mentioned, were also utilized in this case, such as the seizure of assets and conducting follow-up investigations. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a very impressive result, and I think it also highlights, the collaborative efforts with different law enforcement units as well, with the anti-corruption units as well, and the FIU, but also customs officers. Really looking at the multi-agency approach also on a law enforcement level. And I'd like to maybe turn to Tim now with the work on this space and maybe highlight a little bit further some of the collaborative law enforcement you've seen as part of your work with UNODC on dismantling corruption networks underpinning environmental crimes, and maybe also looking perhaps towards, have you worked also with the private sector perhaps on this space, which I think is also an important stakeholder to involve?
Okay, maybe let me start actually with the private sector. At the moment we've got quite an interesting project in Indonesia. I mean, for those of you who don't know the palm oil industry, which is probably very few of you, the money is big. It is hundreds of millions a year. And basically, forests get chopped down so that people can grow palms for palm oil. A lot of places, big driver of forest loss. So we did a risk assessment in the forestry sector in parts of Indonesia, and it resulted a very interesting thing, that the private sector, the actual industry, and the actual industry body for the palm oil industry sort of came forward and sort of, we want to clean up our act, we want to level the playing fields. So we've now got a collective action program running with the palm oil industry body and some of the factors, plus civil society, plus us, plus law enforcement, to look at trying to reduce the loss of forests to basically illegally grow palms. That's going into the private sector. That's really the first time I've seen very direct action. I mean, there's room and there's space for this to happen with a lot, particularly around the forests, with a lot of the forest risk commodities, because a lot of the things that we buy in the shops and the supermarkets are foodstuffs, other products that actually originate from forests, which may or may not have been illegally destroyed. We do not know very often if they've been illegally destroyed. The firms who are selling it do not know if they've been illegally destroyed. Very interestingly, last year in France, a supermarket was prosecuted for selling forest risk commodities without actually having done due diligence along its supply chain. A lot of opportunities there. Now, collaboration with law enforcement, to me, to be honest, it remains a bit of a problem. We work a lot with law enforcement. We build skills, but challenges, particularly with environmental crime. Very often the guy who investigates environmental crime is not the guy or the lady who investigates corruption, economic crime. And very often the worst economic crimes are the most hidden. We saw measure of the elites. I'll tell you a little example which was never uncovered. The perpetrator is now deceased. I only know this example from personal connection. The guy who did this was the brother of my parents, the people who lived on the next farm to my parents. So that's how I know this example. Basically, Central African country, mineral rich. He advised the minister and senior public servants on regulations for granting new exploration licenses. And these, on the face of things, seem eminently reasonable. Only two real criteria. First one, you need to be an existing operator within that country. Second one, you need to have paid all your taxes, license and fees up to date. The day before this regulation came into effect, he made sure his company, which was a listed company, actually a Canadian listed company, had paid all its licenses and fees up to date. That meant that there was exactly one company that qualified for mineral extraction licenses in that country. Now that's how it was done. Now this was, if you look back, he'd been very kind to the minister and the senior public servants for a long period of time because he was rich and maybe they weren't quite as rich. So he helped them. Very subtle. I mean, this was told over a braai, a barbecue, as something he was actually very proud of having done. Now, the thing is, someone who is trained as an inspector is never going to pick that up. Okay? The bottom line, you might pick it up in the money trails, you might pick it up in the finances, but the people who are working on the finances very rarely are looking at this. We identified maybe 7, 8 years ago that there was a need for much closer collaboration between different agencies. And I think saying was that collaboration is not really happening to a great extent yet. So in terms of the experience, yes, you see attempts at collaboration, but you don't really see powerful collaboration. The last point I'll make is to this day, we see large seizures of wildlife, timber products, fish. Very often, customs pat themselves on the back, we've made the seizure, all done. Nothing else happens. And that's commonplace. And it's very sad, because it should be the starting point. Okay.
Thank you, Tim. I think that, that feeds in also towards kind of the establishment behind the Nature Crime Alliance as well, where we are trying to support the linking up of these different stakeholders, because it really requires a multilateral and multi-cooperative effort between the actors. And another big issue, which I think undermines a lot of the efforts, is the financial secrecy in some jurisdictions. And then I turn back to Ian to maybe highlight why financial investigations are so crucial for addressing environmental corruption and the need for addressing financial secrecy and some of the tools for that.
Thanks, Lynn. I think the points that have been raised really point to the fact that financial investigations need to accompany environmental crime investigations, and too often those investigations are not happening. And I think one important reason why they must happen is because you may end up going after the wrong people and really going after people who are vulnerable, sometimes put in the situation where they have to be involved in these kinds of crimes. For example, many of these people are also victims of these criminal networks. So there are good examples of, not good, but illustrative examples of gold mining camps in Brazil's Amazon that have slave labor. You have, in Colombia, the US State Department has noted that there's a strong connection between illegal mining, forced labor, and trafficking in persons, including sex trafficking. That children are often involved in some of these illegal mining operations. In terms of illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, there are a lot of credible reports about forced labor, debt bondage, and others. So I think the point is that without properly investigating the financial aspects of these criminal networks, you're really going to risk victimizing people again, including indigenous communities and other vulnerable communities. We recently have been doing an analysis of more than 200 cases of environmental crimes in the Western Hemisphere. This is a preliminary analysis, and found that only 1 out of 3 cases clearly involved financial investigation dimension. So this was a study that we did that mapped and analyzed publicly available data on environmental crimes as reported in press releases from, say, attorney general's offices, public prosecutors, over a 10-year period from 2014 to this year. And then we focused on Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and in some cases the US and Brazil. So we found that there are very few examples of where financial crime investigations are accompanying those environmental crime investigations. So we need to also ask why are these financial crimes investigations not happening? What are the obstacles? What are the disincentives? And I think, as has been mentioned before, these are really complex, time-consuming cases. And that's another argument, as we've heard in many instances in this conference and many spaces in the anti-corruption community, huge need for accurate, complete registers of beneficial owners to use this information to investigate the financial dimensions of environmental crimes. Investigators may not follow the money because it leads to powerful and politically connected people, and they can fear reprisals. I think we've, in other parts of the world, heard examples of where FIUs are actually doing their job and are stymied from doing that. So that's another reason why financial investigations often don't happen. And I think a third reason that is crucially important in terms of the transnational dimensions is the issue of information sharing. The fact that, for example, in the US, it's sometimes very difficult for investigators in other countries to get information using mutual legal assistance treaty request processes can take many numbers of years. And a recent study that was published by the sort of the monitoring mechanism for the Inter-American Convention on Corruption found that the US Department of Justice has a backlog of over 13,000 requests in terms of requests from law enforcement in other countries to find those investigations. So I think this really emphasizes the need for greater international cooperation, which we can talk more about.
Thank you, Ian. That's really interesting, and I think certainly some challenges still there. What I think is interesting that you also highlighted was the local communities and the vulnerabilities that are there. And I turn now to you, Christina, to talk a little bit about the work of GI Talk in terms, because I know that you also work with engaging local communities to strengthen law enforcement and policy responses to corruption. Could you maybe say a few words about your work in that area?
Sure, thank you very much. Actually, our work with local communities, NGOs, journalists, activists has become a core part of our work. We've launched the Resilience Fund in 2019, which is a grant-making mechanism that supports civil society at grassroots level. And so far, we've supported more than 150 projects in 50 countries. And it's also really a core part of our work on environmental crime and corruption. So as part of EcoSolve, we're currently holding dialogues to understand community perspectives and discuss their relationship with natural resources and challenges and impacts they face because of environmental crime. And being exposed to the risks and vulnerabilities, communities around the world really have very detailed data and information of what's going on locally. What's really interesting is to see that corruption and violence are often cited as key concerns in local communities, as well as money laundering, the distortion of local economies, rising housing prices, etc. But communities don't only have really good knowledge on what's going on the ground, but also know entry points for response that can create change and help protect the environment and prevent environmental crimes more broadly. And so with EcoSolve, we're focusing specifically on building dialogues between the community and law enforcement activities. This is important, I think, because too often communities or NGOs are seen as anti-governmental, as really opposing the actions of the government, and too often the responses to environmental crime that are implemented by the government is implemented in ways which alienate or even abuse local communities. And so the idea of the dialogues is really to bring the two sides together and discuss where communities and agencies involved in the rule of law, law enforcement agencies, but also others can work together towards the joint goal of reducing the impacts and harms of environmental crime on the ground. A key question for us is also how we create impact from our corruption investigations that I spoke about earlier, and I think communities really play a key role in this. It's hard to engage local communities when impunity is so widespread, and this was mentioned a couple of times already. And many civil society actors that we work with and tell us that corrupt actors they feel that corrupt actors will always be a step ahead in the game, or that there's no shame anymore. And so we've been working quite closely with journalists and researchers across communities to analyze what they think reaches local responses and triggers responses at local levels. And it's been really interesting to see how information that is published in different languages, be it English or in local languages and by different outlets, is that local media organization, international one, or social media really has very diverse impact. And it's been quite clear that for change really to happen, we need to work both with the local networks on the ground that are well embedded in communities, understand the local concerns, can push an agenda forward, or also keep a topic on the agenda, as well as the international media and NGOs at the same time. And different messages need to be crafted for different audiences to have impact. So law enforcement, private sector actors, financial institutions, civil society, communities, and the list goes on and on, all have very different priorities and entry points for response, and they also have very different roles to play. And so in exposing corruption, it's important to get the entry point right with each of them and show how different actors can contribute. There's some really interesting work also being done on open data for corruption and different mechanisms to get communities involved. For example, I've been working with an organization in Thailand that is hosting an open AI platform that collects data on procurement contracts and allows people from across the country to send queries about projects that are being implemented in these villages. And it's really a great opportunity to get citizens involved and show that everybody can contribute to anti-corruption efforts, even though procurement takes place in the capital and really far away. I think there are also a couple of concerns with open data and communities, but maybe I'll stop here, and I know we can also address that later on again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think we'll also make sure to have some time for questions and answers, because we have a very full room today, so I want to make sure that we have, I'm sure there's many experts also in the room. But you, again, provided a very good introduction to the next session, which is on possible solutions and policy recommendations. And one of the things that you're highlighting is that the role of different players in tackling corruption, the intelligence that local communities may also provide to law enforcement of what's happening on the ground. That is also something that we are trying with the Alliance by bringing together FIUs, financial institutions, and civil society organizations. I don't want to come into an advert of the Nature Crime Alliance, but I will say that we do have a dialogue which brings together these stakeholders on a regular basis. And just to highlight some facts and figures from the event after a questionnaire is that 80% of the financial institutions that participated in this initiative did not interact regularly with law enforcement or government authorities prior to the dialogue, and 66% of the financial institutions said that they did not regularly interact with NGOs prior to the dialogue. So it does highlight a little bit the gap that we're seeing in terms of where maybe a very important intelligence lies that's not really coming across to financial investigators. Lisa, I would like to turn over to you because your also role as a chair of the UNCAC Coalition Working Group on Environmental Crime and Corruption. And I think it would be a nice place for you to start on what would be the priority areas to address at the multilateral level to tackle this issue from your perspective.
Thank you. A significant gap, unfortunately, still exists between legal frameworks and their enforcement in practice. But the good news is that the legal framework that is necessary to address corruption-enabled environmental crime already exists at the multilateral level. And here I'm, of course, talking about the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC, and then from the crime angle, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the UNODC, which are both binding international legal instruments. Considering the transnational nature of environmental crime and corruption, it is really important that it is prioritized at the multilateral level to ensure this global response to this issue. For example, policymakers at the multilateral level can agree to provide technical assistance at the national level to assist with the effective implementation of the UNCAC in relation to environmental crime and corruption. They can, and this is, also something that was just mentioned, take action to address knowledge or data gaps, but also legislative gaps at the national level. Assistance could be provided to implement the UNCAC at national levels, which would really help harmonize legislation and facilitate international cooperation where it comes to anti-corruption efforts. So policy action at the multilateral level, for example, through the adoption of resolutions, can assist at national levels. Through calls to action. I've just mentioned the provision of technical assistance, but also the UNCAC has provisions included to provide financial assistance to developing countries in this regard. Calls to action to increase the knowledge base of these crime types so that a more tailored action can subsequently be taken. But also such international policy actions can help civil society on the ground and grassroots organizations to refer to these political commitments made at the international level at the national levels. So as you'd mentioned, Lynn, the Wildlife Justice Commission chairs the UNCAC Coalition's Working Group on Environmental Crime and Corruption, which advocates for strong and coordinated measures to be taken at the UNCAC level to address corruption related to crimes that affect the environment. Some priority areas that have been identified by this group, which currently consists of about 230 members of civil society from across the globe, are to strengthen and effectively enforce anti-corruption and anti-money laundering and environmental protection laws across the environmental sector. An additional important point, and this was also mentioned at length during a plenary session just now on environmental defenders, is to ensure a safe and enabling environment for civil society organizations as well as actors exposing environmental crime and corruption. Strengthening transparency and accountability for awarding, granting, and managing contracts in the national resource sector is important. Promoting good governance and anti-corruption measures in the proper use of funds to protect climate, environment, and biological diversity. It's also been a focus area. It was great to see in a number of events at this IACC. And lastly, an important point, to promote greater coordination and cooperation with other relevant fora. So I've already mentioned the importance in addressing environmental crime and corruption is to address both corruption and crime elements in parallel. But we also see a great value to increasing these linkages to, for example, climate fora and human rights fora to really have a collaborative global response to the issue at hand.
Thank you, Lisa. Highlighting some of these instruments. I'd like to also hand over to Tim on your thoughts from UNODC side, looking at the multilateral level and some of these legal instruments that are in place, and what role UNODC could play, and also looking a bit at the technical assistance that UNODC provides.
Okay, I mean, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, we're the custodians of it, also the Transnational Organised Crime, know the corruption one better. It provides a really broad set of anti-corruption tools. It also has a reasonably well developed and review mechanism. It doesn't judge countries, but it does say you've got the tool, you haven't got the tool, you're using the tool, you're not using the tool. It's aimed to be helpful, and at least the executive summary is public, and most countries have looked, it's gone in two phases. Most countries, the criminalisation and the international cooperation have been looked at, those chapters. For about half of the countries, the prevention and the asset recovery chapters have been looked at. So there's a huge, huge range of information and knowledge. Now, what we do more broadly is we use that knowledge in countries to actually help them prioritize what they need to do. I'm talking corruption more broadly at this stage. And at that point, once those priorities are in place, we help them to actually go through different routes to actually meet and address those priority actions. I mean, that route could be we give them direct support. It could be someone else gives them direct support. Someone else can be a bilateral, another multilateral, a civil society organisation. Now, in terms, and so that level of tool is in place. The problem is when we step into the environmental sphere, again, we get to different agencies quite often. I mean, there are examples of cooperation between agencies that have been set up looking to address wildlife crime. I keep going back, and we're still working on this, because the thing that bothers me the most in this space is that there's a simple chain. You have to identify there's a problem. That knowledge has to move to someone who can investigate it. Now, this is where things start going wrong, just at that identification phase. Things I've described, many of them were never identified. Okay, very often, everyone knows something is happening. Civil society knows it. Media have written about it. Press, it never gets investigated. Now, when it does get investigated, does it get investigated by the right people? Believe it or not, your numbers on the number of financial investigations were very heartwarming to me. It's a vast improvement on what it was. We had a project 6 years ago where the target was to get 5 countries to start one financial investigation linked to environmental crime. So you need to get the right people to investigate. You then need the people who are able to prosecute, and you need the judges to adjudicate. All of those things need to be in place. And it's possible, it's doable, but for one agency to give technical assistance and all of that, probably not. It's a collective action, people are coming together, people are looking to act, but I think it needs to be a lot better organised, particularly at the governmental level, and each of those gaps needs to be understood and addressed, because each country, different solution.
Thank you, Tim. That's very interesting to hear about that. I think that there are some developments in terms of also legislative improvement. I agree that a lot of the tools are already in place and not really being enforced adequately, but I think Ian Maybe you can highlight some of the recent legislative developments in this area, such as the Foreign Extortion and Prevention Act, and for the audience members that are not familiar with it, explain a little bit as to how this works and how this could potentially also improve getting more investigations on financial crimes and corruption going linked to environmental crimes.
Sure, I would be happy to, and pick up where Tim left off on a positive note. I think there are new tools that the U.S. has enacted or is about to put in place that would be hugely helpful in terms of following the money and dealing with environmental crimes. The first, as you mentioned, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act came into law just a few months ago. Really the result of leadership and campaigning by the FACT coalition member, Transparency International US. What this does is it's basically the flip side to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which many of you will be familiar with, which was groundbreaking in the 1970s because it criminalized US companies offering to pay bribes to foreign officials. This does the reverse. It criminalizes foreign officials, including immediate family members of foreign officials, offering bribes to U.S. companies or U.S.-listed companies. So the scope of this law is actually pretty broad. There's a question about how the Department of Justice will start to enforce it, but I think people should be aware of the fact of the existence of this new law and thinking about ways that we can start to feed in possible cases for prosecution. The second law, as I mentioned, is the Corporate Transparency Act. The registry is now online. The real owners of shell companies are starting to be disclosed to the government. Unfortunately, it's not a publicly accessible database. So one thing that we're working on right now is ensuring that the US government puts in place access rules which will make it relatively easy for foreign law enforcement, foreign financial intelligence units to get that beneficial ownership information. We've had examples, including in the research that I mentioned on dirty money and the destruction of the Amazon, where financial intelligence units in other countries, including in Peru, told us that they reached a dead end when it came to an anonymous shell company that was registered in the US. So we hope that this information is now going to unlock new avenues for investigation. And that research that I mentioned in terms of looking at 200 cases of environmental crimes in the Western Hemisphere that we're to publish soon found that shell companies were the single most commonly used money laundering typology. So really to underline the importance of that as a vehicle, but also hopefully the value and impact of having a beneficial ownership registry in the US for the first time. A couple of other things that are pending that I'd like to mention. One is that in the US, certain environmental crimes like illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal deforestation are not predicate offenses under our money laundering statutes. So it's important to make those predicate offenses. And I think there are other countries that are in a similar circumstance. So it'd be important to make sure that money laundering, where it's not an all crimes approach, that environmental crimes are predicate offenses. And finally, dealing with real estate. So people love their mansions in Miami. I was told recently about somebody who is in Brazil. He finances the barges, the dredgers that are used in the Brazilian Amazon to dredge for illegally mined gold. He lives a comfortable life in Rio, but he also has houses in Florida. So being able to crack down on real estate, money laundering is hugely important. Luckily, the US Treasury has just issued proposed rules. For the first time, we would have a nationwide anti-money laundering program for residential real estate. So I think there are all these new tools that are coming online, and just finally to emphasize the issue of intergovernmental cooperation. I think The U.S. has a ways to go, but I would also want to give the Biden administration credit for the Timber Task Force, which is now a bit over a year old. It is truly impressive to be in a room where they were celebrating the 1-year anniversary of this task force. At least 15 different government agencies represented, working together to deal with illegal deforestation, including the financial aspects of those crimes. So you had FBI, you had Treasury, you had Justice, you had USAID, you had State, Fish and Wildlife. I mean, the acronyms kept flowing. So I think that is an important example, and it shows also where there's political will, these things can happen. And so if you take the example of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, how quickly did G7 countries work together to exchange information on oligarch assets around the world? We need that level of political commitment to address the financial crimes associated with these environmental crimes.
Thank you, Ian. That is indeed a very positive developments in that area, and it's good to hear. I would like to hand over to Christina because it kind of links well to some of the work that GI Talk is also doing in terms of getting more people access to innovative tools and promote an open data culture to enhance law enforcement responses in this space. And maybe you can highlight some of the work in that area.
Sure, thanks. We're really strong promoters of open data, and I think it has been mentioned by everybody here, the importance of open data, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it's actually not a silver bullet either. And there are a number of things that we really have to keep in mind. So for example, a lack of planning on who's actually going to use the data sets. In the last few years, we've seen more and more corruption data sets being developed, and such as the Thai example, which is great, and I mentioned earlier. And there is more tech, AI, or machine learning that makes it easier to search for data and process it as well. But at the same time, I think it's important to underline that investigative journalists have been under significant pressure, and I think that's also been raised multiple times in this conference already. And there are actually less and less people with the skills and the motivation that are able to use some of these open data sets. So one key finding from our work with open data platforms is that it's been really important to think about the processes that need to be accompanied. So thinking about who will use them and how will open data sets be used, and how can we support the training and the learning of people to exploit the data that we make available. And I think we have to acknowledge that training alone or connecting journalists and researchers on the topic of corruption is often not going to make people actually use the systems. We sometimes think that by providing the space, people will automatically come and take advantage of it, but there's so much out there at the moment. And so I think there needs to be more effort on complementing some of the work, linking up open data sets and showing which piece of the puzzle, which data set is actually trying to address. And maybe a couple of more challenges and opportunities, because we want to end on a positive note, that I also wanted to highlight. The first one goes back to the role of communities, and I've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth acknowledging that open data actually often fails taking into account the role of communities, as it's usually very quantitative. And so far, it seems that it doesn't take the local harms and impacts into account, the violence or the threat that surrounds communities. And communities are also often better connected to informal economies and where licit and illicit intersect, for example, in the areas of informal mining or logging. And so I think the point here is that open data is really important and we see significant potential for it, but it needs to be accompanied with regular qualitative data collection that also covers the local conditions and informality. The second challenge with open data is that it's inherently difficult to make the case for it in places where states or political cultures oppose transparency. And I don't think we necessarily know how to overcome that. But I think even in these contexts, we feel strongly that it's important to continue making the argument and the case that corruption undermines and weakens states, and to provide examples of how more data and transparency can strengthen oversight and delivery. And the third challenge is both a challenge and an opportunity, as environmental resources are usually not prohibited entirely. So with timber, plants, natural resources, there's often a legal and an illegal form of extraction and use. And this requires then the functioning permit system, the use of quotas, licenses, etc. But what we see in environmental crime is often it's the abuse of these systems, and we've talked about it at length here, and widespread corruption that drives and enables the misuse of these systems. So this means, I think, two things for open data. There's a whole set of trade data, which is covering legal goods, and that's a huge opportunity. And while, of course, that doesn't represent the true nature of the flows, it does provide key insights also into the illegal side of things. And that's quite unique for environmental crimes and environmental commodities, because there's nothing comparable for drug trafficking or human trafficking. And so there's actually quite a lot of data on environmental crime that's already being collected, maybe by different ministries than the ones that we usually would have a look at, so trade ministries, environmental ministries, and the data also will necessarily implicate the involvement of state actors to some degree. And so the work done by EcoSolve makes it clear that effective responses can only be designed on the basis of a large range of data, both about illicit markets and about the response itself. In particular, to design preventative measures, we need to understand the consumers and identify the weaknesses in the value chain, monitoring the financial systems. And to disrupt the illicit flows, we need to understand the role of enablers, like the formal and informal financial systems. And so we're working on some of these aspects, but just to conclude, really it's both states and the private sector as well that need to support better data foundation for tackling environmental crime directly, and collaborations around these data. So even public-private partnerships present real opportunities to get closer to obtaining the data that we need to disrupt and improve the response.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. It's interesting to hear that, the uniqueness of this sector and some of the vulnerabilities of this sector also provide for opportunities in terms of some of the data that's usually not available for other crime types. So thank you all. I think it's time to open the floor for questions, and I see immediate hands that are going up. Is there someone for the mic?
Thank you very much. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. My main purpose to join this conference is to talk about the issue of clemency in Ghana. I'm from Taiwan. I'm a university faculty. Because last year, I got to know the clemency is kind of a gold mining, probably you know a little bit, gold mining problem in Ghana. It exists for more than 20 or maybe 30 years. My friend, TI Ghana chair, was there. So I'm here to ask whether you could give me some advice. Well, because I'm wondering, because when I decided, I got kind of a research funding from my university. I considering to go to Ghana, either to go to Ghana or come to TI conference. Finally, I feel that it would be better to come here to get more coalition. Because if I go to Ghana, it's kind of I couldn't do. Maybe I just could do just a little. But here, I feel that after your explanation, I feel that I have some hope. But if you could join, because right now, like 20 years ago, the gold mining is kind of a small scale, very small scale, just by hand. Because right now, they have a more serious problem, because I don't want to mention publicly. There's another country's businessman brought machine. It's kind of a large scale, kind of a gold mining happening right now. And because they want to extract the gold, they need to use mercury. So it becomes another very serious problem of water pollution out there. But before the last year, I have nothing to do. I have no idea about the clemency problem. But right now, I got to know it. I'm not sure. I could have some contribution. together with a TI chair in Ghana there. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I understood correctly, you were looking for opportunities from the University of Taiwan for advice for how best to tackle the problem. Tackle the problem. Well, I think that.
I can help, but I think we should take a round.
Yes. Okay. We'll take a round of questions, and then if you could also state your name and organization that you're from, and then we will come back to you in a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Usha Daniel. I am a Malaysian journalist, and I'm part of the IACC Fellows. My question is directed at Lisa. Lisa, I understand that you brought up the recent MACC arrest of a customs official on 31st May. And I covered that story, and I understand that this MACC officer was charged under the Penal Code, 403 of the Penal Code, which carries a very short sentence of 5 years, as well as whipping and a fine. But we understand that places like Malaysia, which is a key nation for transit, operates under multiple levels of legal laws. So there's the Wildlife Conservation Act, there's the Corruption Act, there's also the Penal Code. How is this a challenge to investigative officers as well as to Wildlife Crime Commission in understanding like if these layers of jurisdiction where these arrests are made can also have a way that a legal way that corruption can happen between these different offices, because we're looking at the Royal Malaysian Police, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, as well as the Wildlife Department, 3 layers of defense, but different legal acts that a lot of these transnational criminals can overcome and see which has the least amount of sentence. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Joaquin Vallejo. I'm the Deputy Director of Democracy, Governance, and Human Rights at the Pan American Development Foundation in Washington, D.C. We work a lot on the problem of transnational organized crime, nature crimes, corruption, and it's very encouraging to see how many tools are on display right now. I'm a huge admirer of all the work that has been on display, and my question is actually very simple. In the backdrop of all of this, we have to deal with the fact that the reason that we still have these problems and the fact that they're so intractable is the fact that the payoffs are so high. So in our efforts to narrow the opportunities, increase the costs, raise awareness, can you think of any success stories at any level where this combined set of approaches has resulted in actually ending a particular type of nature crime and making the cost so high and the opportunity so narrow that the payoffs no longer made sense? And just kind of thinking about the impact, the potential impact of all of these things and have some clarity on whether, I mean, if it's a big if there are any cases of this, and what do you think was kind of like the key factor in the specific case that resulted on that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I have two quick questions. So recently, there is an official from Cambodia landed in USA and have been arrested, and then there is also, I think, a trial, and then the US quit the trial. So my question, but it seems through my research, it seems like the official, like there is also the video that the official committed a crime, but still the U.S. court acquitted him. So whether the speaker on the panel have followed this case, because the macaque monkey that is from wildlife and then have been not only to the U.S. but around the globe too. I think the U.S. mainly for scientific testing. So whether for the, we can consider for scientific rather than wildlife or what. And my second question is like we have seen the technology have been very developed quickly, and like TikTok, Telegram, you know, AI and other stuff so fast. And then the criminal using the code to communicate, to do the conduct a criminal, where the speaker on the panel like holding, how can you hold the giant tech accountable for their crime too, or what? Whether there is nothing you can do about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, if you could also state which organization you're from.
I'm a researcher.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I see one more question, and then we'll go to answers. Thank you.
Hi, Britta Delmers with Public Eye from Switzerland. I have a question on the bio register that Ian spoke about, which I also think is a crucial element in all of this because, as you said, so much goes through these companies. What I see, though, is that normally the entries in these registers are not controlled by anybody. The companies report who their bio is, and I have been told here, I have not verified that, but someone has told me that, for example, in the British register there was an account for an Adolf Hitler, which was not, of course, not true. So the question is, do you think that these registers will really make a difference if there's no control of the entries? And B, if there is no public access to them, we have all seen the many cases where civil society has found very valuable information which the governments by themselves would not have found, the prosecutors. Now we are cut off, or we don't get this information. Will anybody really be able to use it as meaningfully as civil society could?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now turn over to our panelists with a range of different questions. I don't know if one of you would like to start with addressing some of the questions we have. Ian, would you like to take the floor?
I'll try not to take all 3 minutes and 42 seconds, but I'd love to talk to you about Galamsey in Ghana. I've lived and worked in Ghana, and this is a huge issue. It's poisoning rivers all across Ghana. Technically, you can't do small-scale mining unless you're a Ghanaian, but a lot of Ghanaians are fronting for foreign nationals. And as you mentioned, a lot of the small-scale mining is turning into really medium-scale mining and with some serious infrastructure involved. But I'd love to talk to you more about that and hear more about your research. I think the second question, Joaquin, you raised a good question. I would say, and it's not a dodge, that it's only recently that people started to get really serious about this and that there are all these new tools coming on board. But I would say that in the recent past, the issue of conflict diamonds from West Africa, I think is a good case where, as you say, the cost became very high and the payoffs low. That had a number of unique circumstances. One was that you had one player, industry player, De Beers, who was very keen on getting rid of conflict diamonds from the supply chain. You also had, very high-profile, brutal conflicts that were being funded, and these are consumer luxury goods that are very consumer sensitive. So a lot of the issues we talk about, it's like hidden supply chain, so people don't really know whether there's like conflict wood or industrial gold in the products that they're using. So, but I think it's an important challenge. And then finally, on the question on beneficial ownership, hugely important that information is as widely available as possible. We lost the fight politically to make the U.S. beneficial ownership public, but what we're doing right now is trying to make access as broad as possible to investigators. The information will also be available to financial institutions, and they have a vested interest in making sure this information is credible and verifiable. So there will be investments made in the U.S. registry to do that, but the issues that you mentioned with the U.K. registry and others are real.
Thank you. Thank you. I see, Christina, you're also keen to
Sure, I can
say a few
just
words.
jump in very quickly on the question of payoffs. I think for whole industries that's very challenging. We've been looking at specific cases where there's elite corruption and protection, and while there are many more cases where exposure reporting and increasing the cost hasn't worked, there are actually some that stand out and that have worked. And so it's really a question for us to understand what's made the difference there, and why has here exposure reporting and putting names on record made a difference. And then just one very short comment on the social media and the tech companies. I think there's no doubt that they've been a massive facilitator of environmental crimes, but they're actually, social media is also a key resource of data. And while this doesn't really answer the question on how we can hold them accountable, but I think we should at least start using the data that is available on social media, on Telegram groups, on TikTok, and etc. more, and sort of use that to raise awareness.
Thank you, Christina. I think also, Lisa, there was a question from
Yes.
specifically about Malaysian.
Yes, I'll be really quick because I see our timer is running out, so I'm happy to speak more after the session as well. I'd like to generally, because I can't go into the specific of the nature of this case, but I think you do raise a really important question. How do you deal with all different types of legislation, different types of authorities that are involved in such an investigation? Which, I mean, going back to some of the things I said earlier, can provide opportunities as well as challenges. And there are tools such as joint investigation task force that can be set up and putting these relevant law enforcement authorities together. And in terms of, you mentioned specifically sentencing, I mean, one way to go, to strategically go about these issues is really to look at which crime types might actually increase sentencing for these offenses. Unfortunately, in some countries, sentencing for wildlife trafficking can still be quite low, but where, and going back to what Ian said, wildlife trafficking is recognized as predicate offense for money laundering, for example, that could significantly increase sentencing. And then maybe very quickly, happy to say more after, to then hand it over to Tim, but about a success story. In a nutshell, there are a couple of examples. There's still so much to be done, but I'd like to give you an example of our work with the Nigerian Customs Service, where within a 3-year period, we really honed into those techniques and tools that are offered by the UNTUC and the UNCAC that I earlier mentioned, and provided technical assistance and work with the customs authorities to mentor them on special investigative techniques, financial investigations, how to really obtain evidence that is prosecutorable in court, which led to significant successes and arrests, as well as convictions with relatively high sentences in court as well. And Nigeria is a big transit country of pangolin skills, or it used to be. And as a result, we can see, looking at pangolin seizures at least, we haven't seen any big pangolin seizure, so where we can see the involvement of transnational organized crime, so from that nature, coming out of any seaport for the past 2 years. So I think that's a significant. The downside of it is, of course, now there's displacement to countries where there's less of a strong law enforcement response.
Thank you, Lisa. Tim.
I will be super quick. I will just give one success. It actually comes out of corruption prevention rather than enforcement. We worked for years with Kenya Wildlife Service. In 2022, there were 0 rhinos poached in Kenya. They attributed partially to the building of integrity amongst their officials. So success is possible.
Thank you, Tim. That is a fantastic note, I think, to end this session on. And I would really like to thank our expert panelists for this interesting session, and also our audience. And I wish you all a very fruitful continuation of the IACC. Thank you so much.
Thank you.